But today we're going to do more like a kind of something a bit more introductory, which actually follows this tradition because often when somebody, usually in text on the stages of the path, right, which is what we're kind of covering, usually it's early on in those texts, sometimes the first thing taught is a preliminary point, which is they call it the greatness of the teachers, right? There's what's the source of these. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we'll start with talking about the Buddha, because the Buddha is the actual source. The teachings on Buddhism, right? That makes sense. And so maybe we just start with that and then we'll go from there, right? Because, and I want to make a comment about the Buddha's life, and then we're going to go into it in some detail. The comment I want to make is this, as is true in so many things in Buddhism, there are different ways of presenting almost anything. There's various ways of presenting it. And so, in terms of the life of the Buddha, right, I mean, there's no doubt, it's very clear that the Buddha was a historical person. His exact dates, you know, are sometimes debated, but he lived a little over 2,500 years ago. You know, in India, for the most part, although, you know, he was born actually in an area that's now on the border of India and Nepal. It's actually just over the border of Nepal, but at that time, there wasn't a border there, so it was part of India. And I guess one comment I was going to make is this, is some people, when they study the life of the Buddha, right, or tell the life of the Buddha, view it as it's told, like in other words, that he was an ordinary person who achieved enlightenment in that life. Which is an exoteric or an obvious way of viewing his life. Sometimes Mahayana Buddhists, and particularly also Vajrayana Buddhists, like the Tibetan tradition, would say, well, actually the Buddha was already enlightened, and that his life was a teaching. Right? That even the part of his life where he seemed to be not yet enlightened, he was already enlightened, and it was his way of trying to show something to people. And I guess I'll say this. I mean, one thing that's true of Buddhism is that it's quite flexible. So take your choice. It doesn't matter, or you can view it either way. It doesn't really matter, you know. But there are elements of his life. Clearly, if you take it, I mean, one thing that is clear is that you can take his life as teaching certain points, and that's what we're going to explore a little bit today, because it relates to presenting the Buddhist path, right? That he followed that path, and his life sort of embodies some elements of that path. But okay, so we'll just start talking a little bit about the Buddha's life, then we're going to have some interaction around it and so on. But, so I said, the story goes, that the Buddha, right, he was born in a town called Lumbini, which is near the border, now just over the border of Nepal, but right next to India. And they say his father, this is, not just they say, history shows it, that his father was they call him a king, but king in this context has just to explain a little bit, India wasn't a unified, like now India is right, a very large unified country with a large population. At that time, India was not unified. So when you say a king, it means he was king of a region, right? And that there were many different kings who each were king of a region. But, so the Buddha would be called a prince in the sense that he was, ordinarily his course would have been to inherit his father's role as leader of that region of India. And so his father was the head of a lineage or a family called the Shakyas. So later the Buddha would be called Shakyamuni, related to his father's name. So when the Buddha's mother conceived him, they say that night she had a dream. And in the dream, a white elephant descended from the sky and entered her body. So, a nice dream. And then, I guess she had many good dreams while she was pregnant. And then the story goes, when she was getting close to the time of to give birth, actually, I was just, although I've heard the story of the Buddha many times, I was rereading some different versions. But so it's not really clear whether she decided that she wanted to give birth in a grove, or whether she wanted to go back to her mom's house to give birth. But clearly she left the palace. She told her husband she was going to go elsewhere. And one version I heard was that she was going to stay at her mom's house, which would be surprising or unusual. But the story goes that she didn't give birth in her mom's house. She gave birth in a grove of trees. And they say that the Buddha kind of miraculously came out of her side, like stepped out of her side. And the story goes that then he took 7 steps so he could walk immediately. And lotuses sprung up under his feet. And he said, the exact quote, but actually, it's right here. And he said that this was his last rebirth, that he was going to achieve enlightenment in that life. So then, mother and son went back to the palace, and then starts an interesting, like from our own point of view, an interesting thing to reflect on. So his father asked, I guess, a different Brahmins and seers to come and predict the boy's future because the boy had some unusual signs. So he would and they say, like for example, that how we all have lines on our hands, right? They say that when they looked at the young boy, right, which parents do, right, when the baby's there, they all want to check. So when they looked at his palms, they noticed that instead of having normal lines, he had lines on his hand, but they were in the shape of wheels. So they happened to form the shape of 8-spoked wheels. And the same thing on his feet, and so on. So they said, something's unusual about this kid, he had unusual features, and he was unusually radiant, and so the father thought, maybe my son will be something special, which is not unusual for fathers to think. So he asked some seers to come, some Brahmins, some clairvoyants or something, and what the seers said basically was they said, your son has great merit. He is a very unusual person. You're correct. And he's destined to either become, they said if he stays in the world, if he follows your tradition as to become a king, he'll become a Chakravartin king, which I'll describe what that is in a second. And they said, or if he leaves the worldly life and goes off to practice spirituality, then he'll become a Buddha, an enlightened being. A Chakravartin actually is an idea, an ancient idea from India, which is the idea that chakra means wheel. So it's a wheel, and in this context it means wheel-turning king. So basically what they were saying was he's destined to turn a wheel. Either he'll be a wheel-turning king, or he'll be a Buddha who turns the wheel of the Dharma. So those signs of the wheels on his hands and feet had some kind of meaning already to these clairvoyants. Actually, it was quite a poignant moment that the greatest of those clairvoyants who came to see him, it was moving in the story that they say that when he told that to the Buddha, to the Buddha's father, then the clairvoyant suddenly the clairvoyant stopped and started crying. And the Buddha's father freaked out, right? You can imagine if you're a parent and you ask somebody to predict your child's future and the person starts crying, you'd be really nervous. So the father starts to freak out and the guy can't speak for a minute. And the father's like, what? What is it? What is it? What's going on? And that clairvoyant said, I think he's going to become a Buddha. And he said, I'm not crying for you or your son, I'm crying for myself because I'll be dead. He was an older man. He said, I won't be here. He said, I've achieved some kind of something in my life, but what I'd like to achieve is the path to enlightenment. But by the time your son's old enough to teach the path to enlightenment, I won't be around anymore. So I'm not crying for him, don't worry. Which I thought was kind of an interesting moment. But anyway, so they tell the father that either his son will become and the story of a wheel-turning king, they say, is that a wheel-turning king is a king who has so much good karma that he'll succeed in unifying the world, which it's not clear if that meant just India or if that meant the whole world in that context, but that he would unify the known world under his control. So of course, from a fatherly king's point of view, that sounds great, right? Wow, my lineage will rule the world. So you can guess what the father wanted. Actually, isn't that what most fathers would want? Most fathers would want their kids to grow up and be, not all, right? Most want. So he wanted his son to grow up and follow in his own footsteps and become, then his kingdom would become, would unify maybe all of India and Nepal, maybe China too. Sounds good from a king's point of view. Anyway, so then, I'm not going to go into all the detail. So then, of course he grew up, and as he was growing up, they say he was quite, he learned all the poetry and science of the time, and art and writing, and those rules of how kings are to conduct themselves and things like that. But his father decided that a good strategy to keep his son in the worldly life was to insulate him, right? That if the son wasn't exposed to the sufferings of the world, then he wouldn't get interested in spirituality, and therefore he would become a king. So this point I wanted to pause on for a moment for us, because I want us to think about it a little bit, these points in relation to ourselves, because that's a bit like our society. Okay? Actually, I don't think that a king in India at that time could have done as well as our society does. Actually, even a king, right? Because we have we just have better technology. We can insulate ourselves even more, right? Because so his idea was to insulate him from the problems, right, of the world. And so I guess all I'm saying, I'm just pointing out that I think we do that pretty well, right? Like, actually, if you go to India now, you see, if you go, even now, right, much less then, if you go to India, like you'll see, if you go by the Ganges River, you'll see people burning their relatives, right, like outside. Here, you don't see, you don't see corpses much, right? So there's not as much exposure to death. Right? There, it's a lot easier to see illness. Right? Here, sick people stay home or go in the hospital, right? So I'm just saying, that's a bit like our society, right? There's an effort to insulate ourselves. And also, I guess I'll just make a comment, like that's what the ego does too. So in some sense, I think the Buddha's father also, you could take him as representing a quality of our own, both our own society, but our society just reflects us, right? It shows that our ego wants to defend ourselves against awareness of suffering and of loss and of the problems. So that's what we're thinking about. But then we're going to go on, and then we're going to sort of pause and reflect on something. So the father tried to insulate his son, and then at some point the father said, well, you should get married and have children, and that's what kings do, so royal lineage. And so the Buddha married, I actually skipped this. The Buddha's mother died when he was a child, very young, just after she gave birth. So he was raised by his father and his mother's sister, his aunt, who later became the first Buddhist nun. He was hesitant. Actually, they say the Buddha was, at first wasn't sure if he should institute an order of nuns. And then his aunt, who raised him, came and said, of course you should institute an order of nuns. I want to be a nun. And then he said, yes, okay. And that was the beginning of the order of nuns. But so anyway, so the father, so he got married, and he had a son. And then this, I think, so this is a part of the story I really wanted to focus on today, though, and then we'll actually finish it. So the father had been insulating his son, right? Then, at one point, the Buddha is now a young man, he's married, he has a son, he says, well, I want to see a bit of the world, which is what young people often want to do, so it wasn't unusual at that point. And so they say so he decided he was going to leave the palace grounds where the father had kind of built, had a fence and kept everybody who was all obvious sufferings out, had lots of dancers and singers, and they mentioned particularly, they go through it, in some of the descriptions they describe a lot of dancing girls and so on, that the father thought his son would like. So the Buddha said, no, I need to go out. So the father thought, okay, let's clear out all the sick people, like get them all into, which is kind of like our society. Again, he's going out, let's put them all somewhere in a hospital or something, and get everybody away, and even the old people, like they're not supposed to be on the parade route, get them out of town. But so they say then the Buddha got, I think the first time it was in his chariot, with his charioteer, and he went out, and people were waving, and it's like, it was their first time, many of the people, it was their first time seeing their prince, so they were quite excited. Kind of like, you see that now, right, when Prince William, when he went through the chariot, and after his wedding, I guess it must have been a bit like that, but smaller, because the kingdom wasn't as big as England. But so anyway, so the first time he goes out, right, he's in his chariot, and he sees an old man walking with a stick. Somehow that guy some stories say that guy kind of snuck in, you know, because he wanted to see his prince. Other stories say that Brahma or Indra or somebody like that manifested as an old man. Again, take it either way, it doesn't matter really. The meaning's the same, actually, in some sense. But so the Buddha sees this guy with white hair, right, walking with a stick, and he says to his charioteer, his friend Chanda, he said, "What's up with that? What is that?" And his charioteer, who was a smart guy, says, "It's an old man. You're going to be one too someday." You know, everybody gets old. And then I think he might have even said, you know, actually people hope, he said old age, somewhere it says this, I'm not sure if it was at that point or later in the story, but he says, you know, he says, basically people long for old age, right, and yet they don't like it. And the Buddha kept looking and he said, and the Buddha kind of says, even kings get old? Yeah, even kings get old. Princes too? Yeah. So, okay, so the Buddha started thinking about that. He said, everybody. So then he said, let's go back home. and he thought about how old age comes to everyone. Then Buddha went out again. I shouldn't say Buddha, Siddhartha, that was his name at the time. Siddhartha goes out again. That was his name, because he wasn't a Buddha yet, according to this. And yet maybe he was, if you take the other version, so it's up to you. But I'll call him Siddhartha, right? So then Siddhartha goes out again. And the next time, he sees a very sick person. And he says, what's wrong with that person? And his charioteer says, he's sick. But you know, Siddhartha hadn't yet seen a sick person. And he says, sick, what's that? And he describes, well, his body's imbalanced, and he suffers, and he has, you know, causes internal suffering and mental suffering. You know, it's not fun being sick. And again, of course, Siddhartha says, does that happen to everybody? And he says, yeah, that's to everybody. Everybody gets sick. So Buddha goes back home, thinks about that, and then goes out again. And the next time, as I mentioned, happens, right? The Buddha saw, actually, this story is really funny. The Buddha saw somebody well-dressed, right, wearing their best clothes, laying flat and being carried by a group of people. And he said, what's that guy doing? And he said, why is everybody crying? He said, he's dressed very nicely. What are they sad about? And his charioteer said, well, they're crying because he's dead. They're taking him to be cremated, you know, burned up, right? And so, so the Buddha said, what? And he kind of looked and realized the guy wasn't moving. Right? And again, same question. Does that happen to everybody? Yeah, everybody dies. You know? And so at that point, right, Siddhartha really started thinking deeply, and he started looking around, and the story goes, he goes back, right, and he sees his father, he sees his wife, he sees his son, he sees the dancers, and there's kind of a poignant point where he looks at them all and he thinks, well, all these people are going to get sick. All these people are going to get old. All these people are going to die. Which, first of all, is true, right? But is also a kind of an interesting existential reflection. Existential just in the sense of about existence, right? He's reflecting about the nature of existence at this point. And they say he loses interest at that point well, first of all, in entertainments are no longer of any interest to him. Right? All those entertainments are now irrelevant because the entertainer and himself are going to die, and why waste his life in entertainment? And then he thinks also about being a husband and a father and a king, right? And he thinks, well, you know, he thinks things like this. So if I'm a king, right, whether I do a good job or a bad job, all my subjects are going to be dead sometime, right? So what's so meaningful about being a king, actually? And what's so meaningful about wealth? Because if I get sick, it doesn't help me. When I'm old, it won't fix anything. And when I'm dead, it'll be not mine. Right? And even his son, he thinks, well, he's going to die too, actually. Right? And I love him like every other father loves their kid. And then what? Actually, right? Then I die, then he dies, and then, right? he was already, even before, he wasn't a Buddha yet, but he was an Indian person, right? And so he had this view of rebirth, right? So he would think, well, then in some future life we won't even recognize each other. In this life he happens to be my son, and it's my role to take care of him. But actually, first of all, he'll die. I don't know when he'll die. Right? He may get sick and die now. And even if he lives a full life, like, what's the meaning of that? Actually, right? It's the same thing as me, right? He'll live and get sick and die. And is there any meaning to that? And the Buddha had a lot of doubts that there was a meaning to that. Does that make sense? So what was going on internally, right, in this Siddhartha? So already he was thinking, you know, if there's some way to become enlightened, if there's some way to become liberated from all those sufferings, that would be something meaningful. And if I could help others to become liberated from them, that would be something meaningful. And he even thinks, for example, about his father, and he thinks, you know, if I take over his kingdom, because that's what he wants me to do, that's not really doing much for him, actually. Right? He's still getting old, he'll still be dead. By the time I'm some great king, he'll be gone. What's so meaningful about that? He thinks if I could become enlightened and teach my father how to become enlightened, that would be meaningful. He thinks the same thing for his son, same thing for his wife, same thing for all the other people. He thinks if I were enlightened and could teach them a path, that would be something meaningful. Otherwise, if I just entertain them also, that's no more meaningful than me being entertained, actually. Right? So he's quite agitated in mind at this point, and he goes out again, and this time he sees like a renunciate or an ascetic, right? Somebody whose demeanor, they say that the person's wearing the robes of a renunciate and has a demeanor of great peace across his face, right? and his deportment has great peace to it. And at that point, the Buddha looks at this renunciate, right? And he thinks, wow, like, my father's never looked that peaceful. My wife's never looked that peaceful. I've never looked that peaceful. All the people in the palace have never looked that peaceful. The ministers and whatever, you know, my aunt and all those other people, they all are worried all the time. This guy looks like he's quite at peace. And he thinks maybe he knows something about path that has some actual meaning to it. Right? Maybe he's living a life that's not meaningless. And so he inquires about the life of a renunciate, like you're inquiring about the other things, and he learns that renunciates are seeking moksha, or liberation. Liberation from the cycle of death and birth. And he thinks, well, that's something permanent, actually. That's not something that's just like, you know, oh, I conquered some other kingdom, and later they'll conquer us back. Some kind of state of liberation where it's like beyond samsara. And he thought, that sounds quite meaningful. And so, at that point, the Buddha decides that he's going to leave home and become a renunciate and seek enlightenment. So I want to pause, like we'll tell the rest of the life story, but what I want to do now is pause at that point. And I want to first share a reflection, I want to do like an exercise with you guys. But it's this, you know, like I said, later we'll get to the Four Noble Truths, but I'll give a prelude. Right? The very first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. Right? Now, you see what I was saying earlier about the Buddha's life story being a teaching in and of itself. Well, you see what I'm getting at there, right? Like, in other words, you don't even have to come to the, you know, later after he becomes a Buddha and he teaches the first, you know, then when he teaches the first Noble Truths, he can teach about suffering. But his life story is already confronting the problem of suffering, right? In other words, he is already confronting that problem at this point. Because what he's saying, what his life story says, and what he later points out, is that if you're not aware of suffering, right, then you don't seek liberation. You know, if you're not aware of your own suffering, you don't seek liberation. If you're not aware of others' suffering, you don't develop compassion. Or bodhicitta, the mind wishing to achieve enlightenment to benefit others. So the problem of suffering, you know, whether you're thinking, again, if you think of your own suffering, then it becomes the basis of renunciation and seeking liberation. When you're aware of other suffering, it becomes the basis of love, compassion, and the wish to achieve enlightenment for others. So this confrontation with suffering is extremely important. Another teaching in Buddhism that emphasizes that point is the benefits of a human life, right? Which we talked about in the last class a little bit. Right? they say that that's one of the great things about being a human. They say, you know, if you're in some kind of horrible realm, right, like a hell or something, then you're suffering so great you can't even think about it because you're just only suffering. They say, and then the fault of being being in a heaven or a God realm is that you don't have enough suffering, and so you don't reflect on spiritual things. And they say so that, like, in a very fundamental way, being able to confront the truth of suffering is what allows us to make spiritual progress. That's a very basic Buddhist view. And if we don't look at suffering in an honest way, then we don't really begin a spiritual path. So do you see how the Buddha's life really embodies that idea? Right? That the Buddha's life story is in some way also reflective of that, or is a teaching on that. And what I want to raise, because I think it's useful, you know, rather than, because again, you know, like, y'all could read the life story of the Buddha if you want to, so some of you, I'm sure you have, but what I wanted to do today is to think together a little bit about this point. And so what I want to ask you to do right now is to start thinking about, you know, I don't think anybody here is a prince. None of you went out in a chariot. You know, right? But if you're, the premise of this would be, if you're interested in spirituality, if you're interested in Buddhism, if you're interested in enlightenment, if you're interested in compassion, if you're interested in a path, right? That means that you have started in some way at least to confront suffering yourself. Right? That you started, and I want to make a clear difference, because there's one thing to be like in the God realm, right? To use that metaphorically for a moment. That would mean you don't have much suffering. Right? Probably there's not too much danger of that, I think. Most of us probably have enough. Right? I don't think, is anybody complaining they don't have enough? But then there's another issue, that's a real issue, but there's another real issue too, which is being willing to contemplate that suffering, right? Which is what Siddhartha did, right? In other words, lots of people would have seen, think about that, what's unusual about Siddhartha at this point in his life, lots of people would have, you know, Prince would have gone out and seen elderly people and sick people and then a corpse, and would have thought, that's a shame for them. You know, now who's playing tonight? You know, who's on the lute, who's on the sitar, and you know, India. Have you seen some Indian dancing? Is very beautiful, right? Like really wonderful traditions of dancing with the drumming. You know, and so most people would have said, who's on the sitar tonight? Who's playing the mridangam, and who's the dancer? Because the best dancers in town come to the palace, and you know, and so on, right? And like, and that's what we often do, right? Actually, I mean, we have more entertainment than an Indian prince, because we have you can get a high definition TV, and you know, more than any ancient prince ever had, right? Because they never, you know, you have like what, you can have like 200 channels or something if you want to. So we all have lots of entertainment, right? And again, like, you know, he could have said, oh, what's for dinner, right? Well, you know, actually, we have more choices. Even than an Indian prince had, we have more choices for dinner, right? Because here, especially in Washington, right, you can get every kind of food, any culture. So, but that's true anywhere now. Like, even in, I was surprised, even in small towns, you get Thai food, Indian food, right? All kinds of food. So most people, right, at that point would have thought, that's a shame for them. You know, now what's for dinner and who's playing tonight, right? And what was unusual about Siddhartha was that he didn't do that, right? Even though he had lots of entertainment and people were trying to entertain him and distract him, something about him made him not interested in that, right? Made him, they say like he just completely lost interest, like, you know, that it was just like the idea of being entertained rather than facing truth was sickening to him, actually. It would be like nauseating. So he wasn't able to do it. And so he kept, you know, thinking about what he had seen and what that meant. I'll share one other reflection of that. Like Arya Deva, who was a later Buddhist scholar and saint, who was a student of Nagarjuna's, he said, you know, when you see that someone died, right? He said, foolish, unwise people or foolish people just think, oh, how sad for them and their family, and then move on. He said, anybody with intelligence thinks, oh, they died, I'm next, and so is everybody I know. You he said that's what smart people, when they see that someone died, they recognize that everybody's in that together. Right? They don't think that's a shame for them, that they're somehow different from me, which is what ordinary people do. Right? And so Siddhartha was being the kind of person that Aryadeva would have thought was wise. Of course, Aryadeva was Buddhist, so it's not surprising. He learned that from the Buddha in some sense. But what I want to ask you to do is this. So what I want to ask people to do is, usually we do an interactive exercise, so I want to do that now. And then we'll go back and tell the rest of the Buddha's life story and reflect on it a little bit. But what I want to ask you to do is to think about and then share with, let's group, I want to make it small groups, so just break up into groups of like 3. What I want to ask you to do just is to share with each other, just have an interaction. I want to be clear, because for people who weren't here in the previous class, the reason why I suggest, why we do this, isn't just to talk, it's not just because there's some benefit in just speaking, but it's a way of contemplating. So I think hearing each other's stories allows us to contemplate more deeply. So that's why I'm suggesting doing that. So what I want to ask you to do is this, is to break up into groups of 3, 2 or 3, let's say, and to share, for you, what was it? What were those sites? Was it something that happened in your life? Was it something that happened? Was it one thing, or was there a number of things? But what was it that caused you to awaken to the truth of suffering enough that you wanted to live a life of meaning, or live a life that contained a path, or live, whatever it was for you? I don't want to give too much language to that. But you understand the question. What allowed you to confront suffering enough that you reflected on it and didn't ignore it? And you can also include, are there ways you still do ignore it? If that's too much. Does that make sense? So you can include that too. But let's go ahead and just take 10, 12 minutes, something like that, and do that. And so take 5 or 6 minutes each, share the story, then we'll come back together as a large group. Okay, so I just want to I'll go on and tell some more about the Buddha's life, and then I want to just do that and tell a little bit about after the Buddha's, after him, the history of Buddhism, just a little bit. Not going to go into huge detail, but that's part of what I want to do today, and I'll explain what. Actually, maybe I'll explain why now. If you look, for those who are doing, again, anybody can take these classes, but for those who are doing the readings, right? I suggested starting in on, and between now and next time, trying to finish. It's about 100 pages in Pabonka Rinpoche's text, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. And so in there, under the greatness of the teachers, that's a heading, actually, right? That's the majority of that section. He talks about, that basically you contemplate the greatness of the teachers of the stages of the path, partly in order to develop an appreciation for the path itself, right? In other words, that it's giving you, in other words, the only way we can get a sense of the result of something is by looking at people who have practiced it to the end. So, and he tells a beautiful telling. I'm not going to go through the details, but if you read that, he has a beautiful telling of the life of Lama Atisha, great Indian teacher. And it's also, one is it's beautiful to read, it's a wonderful story. And another is, you'll notice a lot of parallels to the Buddha's life story, actually. He was also a prince and so on. So, and there are a number of parallels in their lives. But that's because, sometimes Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, actually if you, he calls it the, doing the deeds of all the holy beings of the past, or something like that. Whereas, there are great individual differences between different enlightened Buddhist teachers, but there are certain patterns that are always there, because, nobody becomes enlightened without being aware of suffering. Nobody becomes enlightened without meditation. Nobody, so there are certain parts of their lives that all have parallels. Speaking of meditation, right? Once the Buddha, once Siddhartha rather, saw those 4 sights, there's a beautiful telling of his leaving home and how his charioteer was heartbroken, and even his horse was heartbroken, the horse that he rode away on, and then he sent, and then he finds this kind of poor wanderer. He's wearing the clothes of a prince, and he asks to trade. He says, would you please trade with me? You can have my clothes if I can have yours, because I can't wear these anymore. And he takes his sword, and this is also beautiful, right, because he's a prince, right? I mean, ordinarily his sword should have been used in battle, right, to conquer other kingdoms, and instead he uses his sword to chop off his hair. And then he gives the sword to his, I think his charioteer, and his clothes to a poor wanderer, and his charioteer begs to stay with him, but he says, I have to, this is the path, I have to travel alone, kind of thing. Sends his charioteer back on the horse. and starts 6 years of meditation, in which he studies with other, he kind of asks questions of other wandering teachers in India. This was a time, by the way, in India of great, there were a lot of people who were seeking moksha, right, which means liberation. So there were a lot of ascetics, and people had different ideas. So, and you read in the Buddha's life story, as he wandered around, he met people, and he was a very smart young man, and so he would ask somebody like, well, what's your path, basically. And many times people would say, well, I stand in fire and bear the suffering of that, or I do this, or they had all these different things that they thought. And you see him like kind of thinking, going, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then, one person said, well, I do a lot of virtue because I want to be reborn in paradise. And then the Buddha says, well, is paradise permanent? And they say, no, it was rebirth. So, no, but I want to be reborn there. And he says, well, if it's not a permanent solution, why bother? That's the same as going back to the kingdom and being a prince. That's not use. And he's very polite about it. You read where he doesn't put anybody else's path down, but they describe what he thinks, And then he's very polite and he says, oh, thank you for explaining that, and he leaves. So then at one point, he starts practicing asceticism, right, where he doesn't eat much. And there are these statues, sometimes the Dalai Lama talked about this, that there are many statues like this of the Buddha where his ribs are all showing, and he's so emaciated. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says that, I think he has one of those statues, a small one, and he said how he often looks at that and contemplates the great effort that Buddha went through, right, to achieve enlightenment, and that moves him, and I think he sometimes cries to think of the effort that Buddha made. So the Buddha spent 6 years, right, practicing meditation, then he kind of was emaciated, and he was with these 4 other ascetics. So they were all kind of emaciated and meditating, and just trying hard, and they developed deep concentrations in meditation and so on. And so then one day, right, the Buddha thinks, this isn't the path, this is not correct, right? He says this is mortifying the body, and mortifying the body is not the path to enlightenment. This is an important point for all future Buddhists, right, that the Buddha made that point, that that's not the practice to achieve enlightenment. And then this is not yet the philosophical, there's 2 different middle ways in Buddhism, by the way. There's a philosophical middle way, right, which is the philosophy of emptiness. This is a different middle way, but the Buddha says, I have to follow a middle way, right? Like in other words, not the extreme of indulgence, like when I was a prince, not the extreme of asceticism, like I'm doing with these other 4 ascetics, but some kind of middle way where I eat some and take care of my body, but then practice, mainly focus on inner training, right? So it's quite a pretty story where then he goes to what's now called Bodh Gaya, right? Where actually right now there's like 200,000 people there with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because Dalai Lama is giving Kalachakra Bodh Gaya right now. So many people came from all over the world there and so on. So the reason they gather there is because that's where the Buddha went. And actually Bodh, right? Bodh means enlightened, and Gaya means earth. Right? So it's the earth of enlightenment, the place where the Buddha. And so they say he went there, and then a young farm girl gave him a mixture of, I think, milk rice with honey in it. And he drank that, and it refurbished his body, kind of gave him strength again. And this is quite nice. So then he went and he sat down under the Bodhi tree, right? The tree there in Bodh Gaya. And this was going to be his seat of enlightenment, and he knew that, right? He somehow intuitively knew he had the karma, or the readiness, or the merit, or the inner training to enlighten. And he said, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he said, the sky may fall and the earth may crack open, but I'm not getting up until I'm enlightened. Which is quite brave. Isn't that quite a moving moment? Like he sat down there and he said, this is the last seat on which I'll sit as an unenlightened person. I'm not moving from this spot. So he sat there, and then comes an interesting part of the story, right? They say through 4 parts of the night, these different things happen, right? But anyway, so he entered deep meditation. They say particularly he meditated on the nature of the self, or the nature of phenomena. What's the ultimate truth? How do things exist? And then they say that Mara, right, who's kind of like, you could say like the devil, but actually Mara is really more, you could say, or more like a god, just a worldly god who wants beings not to be enlightened, right? A worldly god who wants samsara to continue. But they say first, Mara sent his army of demons to the Buddha to try to make war against it, because he said, they say Mara thought, if the Buddha becomes enlightened, everybody, he's going to enlighten all these other people, and my realm of desire is going to be weakened. So they say he sent his hordes of demons to stop the Buddha. So they say the Buddha actually saw them, right? These kind of demons came, were hurling things at him. And this is the part I think is quite interesting, because again, this is important in terms of Buddhist practice, is what did the Buddha do? They say he entered a meditation on love. Right? So as these kind of visions of attacking came, he meditated on love for his enemies. And there are beautiful paintings like this, where they show these kind of demonic forces throwing wheels made of sharp edges, and swords and arrows and spears and things like that, right? And as they're coming, you see them kind of gradually transforming, so that finally when they reach the Buddha, they fall as a rain of flowers. Right? And so this is a beautiful point, actually, right? This is a fundamental Buddhist teaching embodied in that part of the story also, right? That they say, the first Dalai Lama in his poem telling the Buddha's life says, you conquered Mara's army with the weapon of love, only using the weapon of love. So that's also a fundamental Buddhist idea, right? And it's also very much, it's a wonderful idea also that really comes from, I think that, well, I mean, it was the Buddhist life story embodies it, but that also, in many ways, I think was one of India's many great contributions to the world, and one of them was that, right? was meeting aggression with love. So they say that the Buddha meditated on love, and he didn't have to fight back, right? There was no fighting against Mara's army. Just the power of love itself overcame them. Do you get a sense of that, of what that means? Right? Like, that's our job, right? That's something that anybody. I just want to pause there again, because that's something that we're supposed to do too, right? There is the Buddha. I think that's again, if you take the Buddha's life story as a teaching, that's a nice teaching. Right? When met with aggression, if you're practicing Dharma, meet the aggression with love. So Mara sent the two of the main things that bind us to samsara were embodied. So first, Mara tried anger or aggression. That didn't work. So then they say Mara sent his daughters, who are these dancing, beautiful goddesses. And again, the Buddha was unshaken. What's the meaning of that, though, right? It's desire. In other words, it's saying, because two of the main delusions that bind us to samsara are anger and desire. So the strongest anger is war, right? And usually in our realm, the strongest desire is sex, right? So that's why he sent them, whatever. People who were supposed to tempt the Buddha in that way. They call this the desire realm in Buddhism. That we're in a realm. Our realm is the realm of desire. So we've seen will that tempt the Buddha? It didn't. And then there comes another, I think, quite moving point in the story. So as Mara is, trying to defeat the Buddha, there comes a point, and this is why the Buddha is always, is usually depicted, right? He's holding a begging bowl, right? Because the begging bowl is because he's no longer an ascetic, right? He's willing to accept now food, right? So he's holding a bowl that symbolizes that. And then right, his hand, there are different mudras in Buddhism, right? This is the mudra of meditation, right? Like that, in your lap. But at this point, the Buddha takes his hand and touches the earth like that, right? So, and not all Buddhas do that. Some Buddhas are in the teaching mudra, and some Buddhas, there are many different hand gestures. But Shakyamuni Buddha, right, his hand gesture, you can see it here in the statue, is with his hand like this, touching the earth. And they say, right, that what's the symbolism of that? In the story, it goes that as Mara was attacking and so on, that the Buddha didn't say anything in his own defense, but at some point he touched the earth. They call it touching the earth for witness. And what it means, right, is that the earth, he kind of, it was almost like tapping the earth goddess herself, saying, hi there. And they say the earth goddess herself, like the earth in the form, so earth itself in the form of a goddess arose and said to Mara, basically, again, I'm not going to remember the exact words, but she basically said, I've been here all along, and I've seen him, this Shakyamuni, for countless eons, sacrifice everything for others. I've seen him give up his body, chop off his, offer his head, offer his limbs, offer everything he had, offer his kingdom, offer his wealth, offer his life, offer everything imaginable to the path to enlightenment he's given away everything, and so his merit is unstoppable, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop him from becoming enlightened, basically. So that's quite interesting, right? His relationship to the earth itself. That, I mean, this mudra, this gesture, is a symbol, right, of the Buddha's connecting to the earth, and of the earth in some sense resonating with or witnessing his compassion and his sacrifice. And so at that point, Mara gave up. When the earth herself stands against you, you can't win. But so anyway, so Mara gave up, and then they say this was all through the night, right? So this is like the Buddha's last night as an ordinary, unenlightened being from this point of view, if you view him as that point. And they say then at dawn, as the sun rose, the Buddha became a Buddha, or Siddhartha became a Buddha. And they say, you know, he saw the ultimate, he saw everything, I guess, in one sense. He became fully enlightened. And then, so I'll go through, so then briefly, you know, so then the Buddha stayed there for a little while, and they say he contemplated, well, will anybody even understand this path? Could anybody even understand this? Is it worth teaching it? They say that, the story goes that Brahma, the king of the gods, came down and offered him a golden 1,000-spoked wheel and said, please turn the wheel of the Dharma. That's why, he says, you know, I know, I was, you know, because Brahma lives a long time. Right? So they say, Brahma says, I know, I saw that you long ago vowed to become enlightened to benefit others. Now you've become enlightened and now is the time for you to help others. You can't just stay here in silence. And he gave him a wheel as a symbol of that. Because a wheel is a very powerful symbol also in ancient, actually not in India. In India, the wheel is a powerful symbol, right? There's that Chakravartin king, the wheel-turning king. And then the Buddha, the main symbol of the Buddha was, actually some people say that the main symbols that were created during the Buddha's life were wheels that symbolized the Dharma, that there were not many statues made at that time. That was the more common symbol. So, and actually, so I'll tell one other part of the story I think is quite nice. So they say that the Buddha, you know, sat there for a while contemplating, and then he got up to go teach. And they say that he went to Varanasi, which is not too far. It's a little distance actually, but not too far from, it's the same region there of India. And the way I heard the story, which I thought was quite humorous, was that from a long distance, he was looking for the 4 guys he had meditated with, those 4 ascetics. And the way one of my teachers told me the story was that when they saw him from a distance, they said, that's Siddhartha, he gave up, he's quit asceticism. Let's ignore him, let's pretend he's not there, which is a little immature. And so they said, when he comes, we'll just keep meditating and we'll sort of not even look at him. You know? And they say that as the Buddha got closer, though, his radiance and his, you can actually imagine this, actually, that his radiance, but also his way of carrying himself, so reflected what he had realized that without looking at each other, each of the 4 stood up and bowed over, without meaning to, in some sense. Because they could see on his face and through his deportment that he had realized what they had not. Does that kind of make sense? And so at that point it wasn't any longer a matter of their ego saying, well, he's not as cool as us for not. That they realized that he had gained something that they didn't yet have. And then he taught the 4 Noble Truths to them, which was his first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, right? And so then, basically then, for the exact number, 40-something years, Buddha continued. You know, he traveled all around India and he taught all kinds of people, right? So if you read the sutras, now I'll say the sutras, right, are the teachings of the Buddha. So if it's a Buddhist sutra, that means the Buddha taught it. Does that make sense? Or the Buddha was there and inspired it in some sense. Because sometimes, like, for example, in the Heart Sutra, the Buddha doesn't talk much, Avalokiteshvara he talks. But the Buddha's present, and they say inspired by the Buddha, right? And at the end, the Buddha says, good job. So those are the sutras, were teachings given by the Buddha. And so he did that for about, around 40-something years. And then, and he established the monastic orders, and he taught to, if you read the stories also, it's quite nice actually, I mean, right, because he taught to all kinds, because he never set up actually any big, he didn't live inside a temple, he lived outdoors actually. And he would teach, he would sit under a tree, or he would sit on a rock or something, and he would teach. sometimes they would make a little cushion for him out of grass, and then he would teach. And he didn't write books down, he just taught. And they say Shariputra, who was his attendant, traveled with him all the time, and he was one of those people who had like, there are still people like that, right, who have a memory where they never forget anything. He had that, and so he remembered all the Buddha's teachings, and after the Buddha passed away, he was the one who started the oral tradition of reciting everything the Buddha had taught, and later it was written down. So the Buddha taught for many years, and you see also he taught like all kinds of people, poor people and rich people, you know, everybody from, you know, in India there's a caste system, so everybody from untouchables to kings, but he didn't acknowledge the caste system actually. He said a person is noble or not noble according to who they are inside, not to their birth, right? So to him that was irrelevant, so he just, you know, there's one, this is a little aside, but I'll just say it briefly. There's one funny story like that where a king, right, and now the Buddha was familiar with kings, right, because his dad had been one, but a king invited him to come teach. And there was a tradition of that the Buddha would dedicate the merit from an offering to the person's enlightenment. Right? So this king made a big feast, the Buddha was there, then the Buddha stood up to dedicate the merit, and he pointed to some guy sitting outside the fence, like some poor guy. And he said, I dedicate the great merit he has created to his enlightenment, and to all beings' enlightenment. And the king got offended, of course. He said, wait a second, I offered this big feast. And the Buddha said, you offered, he said you did, but you offered it with a sense of trying to show off. That was your motivation, was trying to be impressive. And that guy was rejoicing in a very sincere way, so he created a lot of good karma, you really didn't. So there's not much to dedicate in your direction. But he has a lot, because his motivation was sincere and yours wasn't. So I'm dedicating his merit, you didn't have much merit. So the Buddha was, my point there though is that the Buddha wasn't shy to speak the truth. Right? Whether it was criticizing the caste system, or whether it was, you know, telling that to a king. You know, he was pretty direct, but there's also the sense clearly in the Buddhist teachings of that he also spoke according to the level of the person he was meeting, right? So if he was meeting an uneducated person, he spoke in a language, and he would give a lesson that would be relevant to their experience. If he was speaking to some great scholar, then he would debate in a scholarly way with them or something. If he was speaking to somebody who was a yogi, he would speak from the perspective of meditation. And you see that if you read the actual stories of the Buddha, that there's a sense of his, I guess addressing people, sometimes they call it upaya in Sanskrit. It means skillful means, right? So there's a clear sense of that if you read the sutras of the Buddha, is this kind of sense of skillfully meeting people at the level they were at. And so then later in Buddhism there became a whole tradition of interpreting, in other words, not really interpreting, but of saying which of the Buddha's teachings are definitive and which are skillfully taught for a particular person, but are not definitive. You know, and there became a whole tradition of interpreting that, but using logic and so on. But anyway, so then eventually, at the age of I think 84, Buddha passed away. They say passed into parinirvana. Or sometimes they say in order to teach the truth of impermanence, Buddha entered parinirvana. If you take it as a teaching. But okay, so so now I just want to briefly share a couple more things, right? So then, of course, right after the time of the Buddha, then there were many, you know, in India for many, you know, from that time, which is around a little over 2,500 years ago, let's say, then there were like many, many great Buddhist teachers, right? And just a very brief thing about Buddhist history, because some of you may know and some may not. So this is good to share because sometimes there's confusion, right? So they say that when the Buddha was alive, he very openly taught the path to individual liberation, which is sometimes called, sometimes Mahayanists call that Hinayana. Right? Sometimes people call it Theravada. Actually, there are many sub-schools of that grew up after the Buddha passed away, which were just traditions, right? But in other words, the emphasis there was how does a person achieve moksha? Which I mentioned earlier. How does a person achieve liberation from suffering? And we're going to go through this in great detail through the rest of this class, but the basic emphasis in that is that how does a person achieve liberation? They have to at least do 3 core things. Live an ethical life, be ethical, develop single-pointed concentration in meditation, and then you develop wisdom. Wisdom is the actual liberator, but you can't realize wisdom without those other two. If you're not ethical and you can't meditate, then wisdom won't have any power, and it won't affect your mind. So because you have to meditate deeply on wisdom. So the first tradition that kind of grew popular in India was this tradition of seeking individual liberation through those three things. And there was a lot of emphasis, first of all, on monasticism, and then on meditation and training. So that was the emphasis for a long while. And then Mahayana, right? So sometimes, again, actually there was a tradition called Hinayana, but they're meant, again, I'll just call it individual liberation, right? A tradition that emphasized a person's personal liberation from samsara, from suffering. So then, basically Mahayana Buddhism became popular around the time of Arya Nagarjuna, who was a great, who was probably I don't think there's any Buddhist teacher more famous after the Buddha than Nagarjuna. I can't think of one, in all Buddhist traditions. All Mahayana Buddhist traditions, rather. So, actually, I should say this. So also this Theravadan tradition, or this tradition of individual liberation, tended overall, it was everywhere, right? It was all through the Buddhist world, but particularly that specific tradition became very strong in the south. So in places like Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, places south of where the Buddha lived, those places, now Mahayana did travel there, but but the Theravadan tradition became very firmly rooted in those places. So sometimes nowadays people say the southern traditions, meaning this tradition of individual liberation. Right? But anyway, so then Nagarjuna came, and the story goes that Nagarjuna, who was this incredible Buddhist saint and philosopher, the story goes that there were these Mahayana, or great vehicle, teachings. Right? And great vehicle, the reason why it's called great vehicle is that there's a different emphasis. Right? In the first tradition, I was talking individual liberation, the emphasis is on achieving one's own salvation or liberation from suffering. That makes sense, right? So Mahayana, the idea is that the path is of the path of a bodhisattva. So this one of course still, by the way, one is going to achieve one's own liberation, but the emphasis is on achieving enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So the idea in this tradition, Mahayana, is that one wants to become not just individually liberated, but wants to become a Buddha, equally realized to the historical Buddha, in order to be maximally of benefit to others. So it's a path that emphasizes compassion, and that emphasizes what's called bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is the mind of bodhi, the mind of seeking enlightenment for the benefit of others, for the benefit of all beings, actually. Not just others, because if it's just others, that's not yet bodhicitta. Bodhicitta has to be that it doesn't leave anybody out. So even the worst being, even your worst enemy, you want to achieve enlightenment even for them. So they say that, these teachings by the Buddha, they say actually there were teachings that the Buddha had given that he felt India was not yet ready for, the world was not yet ready for. So he taught them, but then he asked these beings called the Nagas to hold on to those teachings until Nagarjuna's time. It's the same name, Nagarjuna and Naga. So then they say that Nagarjuna then recognized, oh, this is the time, the world's ready. He went and took those teachings, then he gave them publicly out. He sent out copies of them, and then he started composing commentaries on those teachings. So then after Nagarjuna's time, actually I'll mention one other, there are many great Indian scholars, but there are two that I want to mention here. One is Nagarjuna, who particularly taught the teachings on the Mahayana teachings, but he emphasized the teaching of profound wisdom. He established a lineage of that came from the Buddha that was extremely clear. After him, another great Indian master who arose was Asanga. He had a brother, Vasubandhu. There were two brothers who were great Buddhist scholars. And so and actually they both commented on these, of all the Mahayana sutras, so sutras are teachings of the Buddha, right? Of all the Mahayana sutras, probably the most popular, let's say, or the ones that are particularly profound, we would say, are the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. The Heart Sutra is the shortest, a very short, not the shortest, but a very short one. There are some that are very long, that have 100,000 verses, and 8,000 verses, and 25,000 verses. So Nagarjuna commented on the ultimate meaning of those sutras, which means emptiness. He commented extremely clearly on that. And he established a lineage. There was a lineage that came down from him for understanding the profound ultimate meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which means the ultimate meaning of reality. Does that make sense so far? Asanga then, this is why I'm just mentioning it for a Buddhist history reason. Then Asanga said, you know, there's another way of understanding those sutras that's not about their ultimate meaning, but is about presenting the details of the path that one goes through to become a Buddha. So it's not, you know, one has to understand the ultimate meaning in order to achieve that, but yet he was kind of like, so he said, you know, there's an implicit meaning in those sutras about how does one progress, and what are all the stages, and what are the different details of practices that one has to do. And he said, somebody better explain that, so he, with the help of Maitreya, composed various treatises explaining those. So when you see a lineage tree, sometimes there are these trees, we don't have one here, I'm at the house, but sometimes you see like the Buddha or Lama Tsongkhapa in the middle, and then you see these two lineages coming down, these two like groups of people. So one, they have Manjushri and then Nagarjuna, and then a lineage coming down. And the other, you have Maitreya and then Asanga, and then a lineage coming down. So that symbolizes these two great lineages that came down from the Mahayana tradition. So Mahayana Buddhism particularly spread north. So China, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, Bhutan, you know, I'm just giving some examples, and especially Tibet preserved the Mahayana. But so Tibet actually preserved both, though, because the monk's vows that Tibetan lamas take are from a Theravadan tradition. And many of the other traditions, you know, they have many texts and teachings from those traditions, but they put great emphasis on Mahayana training. You know, that's on the path of the Bodhisattva. So both of these lineages from Nagarjuna and Asanga came to Tibet. So who brought them to Tibet? Other people did too, but the most important, one of the most important was certainly Atisha, who I mentioned is in the Lam Rim book, if you do that reading. So one thing that was interesting about Atisha is he collected both of those lineages in himself, right, and practiced them both. And then when he was invited to Tibet, as it describes in that book, right, actually, okay, yeah, this is worth sharing. So why was he invited to Tibet? Because Buddhism in Tibet had become degenerate. Right? People were doing all kinds of weird stuff, basically. It's kind of like, I think it's like Buddhism in America sometimes now. You know, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what to do and what to practice, and people were doing different things. And so, actually, the stories, you'll read it, but I'll just say very briefly. So the king, again, Tibet at that time wasn't unified, but a major king in Tibet gave his life, actually. He had been taken prisoner, and they demanded a ransom, and his nephew said, well, I have this gold that we collected to give to Atisha to bring him to Tibet. Why don't I'll use it to ransom you? And he said, no, I'd rather die than have Atisha come to Tibet, because he'll clarify Buddhism here. So the nephew went to, that's an offer that Atisha couldn't refuse, right? He come down and said, my uncle gave his life so that you'll come to give our, you know, the king gave his life so that you'll come benefit our country. So Atisha came there. So my point is this, so Atisha composed a text called A Lamp on the Path to Enlightenment, which combined those two great streams. That's why I'm giving this brief overview of Buddhist history here, is that Atisha, when he wrote that text, he brought those two great streams from Nagarjuna and from Asanga together in one. And that began a literary tradition in Tibet called Lam Rim. Lam is path, and Rim is stages. Right? So stages of the path to enlightenment began with, when Atisha composed that book. You see, the point here, though, is he didn't begin the teachings themselves. It's just he began a certain literary tradition of combining them in a certain way. And what he did was also why it's called stages of the path. And this is why I think it's now this is why I'm actually covering this. One is so that you have a sense of the history, right, of how it came down from the Buddha. But the other is this: is that what Atisha did, which is what we're going to be covering in this series now, is he composed this thing called stages of the path, right? Which clearly presents how to practice the Buddha's teachings in step by step by step by step. Because remember what I said earlier? The Buddha wandered around India for 40-something years, right? And people asked him questions, right? And he answered them. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, sometimes people ask him, and he says, you know, they say, well, we should translate all the sutras. Somebody said we should translate all the sutras into English, and people should read them. And somebody said, you know, of course it's good to translate sutras, but he said, but people won't understand them very easily, because, you know, somebody asks this question and somebody asks that question, and sometimes it's hard to understand what the Buddha meant. How does it apply to oneself, right? And so, and then also there are Hinayana and Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings. And if you practice them out of order, you get, that was what was happening in Tibet at the time. People were practicing, for example, Tantric Buddhism before they had been well grounded in ethics and wisdom, and then they were doing kind of weird stuff and wasn't working. And then sometimes like people thought, oh, you know, I'm Mahayana, so I don't care about being a monk, which was totally wrong. And other people like were practicing monasticism and thought, well, so this thing about bodhicitta is not important and Tantra is totally crazy. That's wrong, right? So there are all these wrong views. So Atisha, when he wrote the Stages of the Path, he had studied Nagarjuna's teachings, you know, that lineage. He studied Maitreya's lineage. He did study he was a great monk, very pure monk, and he had studied Tantra in depth. So what he did was, he presented the teachings in a clear way that showed this was the Buddha's intent, right? When the Buddha taught all these different teachings, here's where you fit them. You know, if you read a sutra that says this, it fits at this point in the path. If you read a text that says that, it points at this point in the path. And it said you'll read this in Pramod Rinpoche's book. It says there, one of the great benefits of studying the stages of the path that we're going to cover in this course is then you understand the entire intent of the Buddha. Right? Otherwise, you could read the Buddha's teachings for many years and not understand their intent, right? And also, you avoid what they call the great fault of just criticizing, like, you know, there are sometimes people do this. If they haven't studied the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, then they read like these Buddhist texts and they think, that doesn't make any sense, that's silly, right? Because they don't know how to fit it in to the practice. Once you read the stages of the path, then if you go back and study like teachings of the Buddha or teachings of ancient Indian teachers, they all make sense. Otherwise, I've seen this. I've seen many people where they haven't studied the stages of the path much, and let's say they start studying some topic like I've studied where people study like these philosophical books, for example, right? And they think, oh, this is boring. This has nothing to do with practice. Like this is stupid. People say stuff like that, you know. But and like you realize, oh, they just haven't studied the stages of the path, so to them it is because they don't know how to apply it. But if you study the stages of the path, then it's like whatever philosophy book you read, even if it seems like very what's the word? Even if when you first look at it, it can seem very far from practice, immediately it's clear. Oh, you practice it. Here's how you practice it. It's at this point in the path, right? Even with like tantric teachings that can seem very esoteric, if you study the stages of the path, then it's clear. Oh, that's what this is. It applies right here. So it's really great if you can, you know, if you get this sense of like the overview of all the major steps in the path, then all the other teachings make sense. Does that make sense? So Atisha's gift, was amazing. And actually, they say that when they sent that book, he sent a copy of his book back to India, and at first everybody had been upset Atisha had gone to Tibet, right? Because he was great. He was actually one of the 3 greatest scholars in India at the time. But once he sent the text back, they said, well, it was worth it. Because this text is so clear. You know, nobody had written anything like that. So one more historical detail. Do you mind this little bit of history lesson? It's okay. One last historical detail is worthwhile. So then in Tibet, there arose over the course of Tibetan history, because this again gets confusing to people, that's why I want to say it clearly, there arose like many different like lineages in Tibet, which now there are 4 main ones that still exist. Some of them died out and some got combined into other lineages. But so I just want to say them because, so one is Nyingma. Right? Nyingma means ancient or old, the old one. Like that's because it was the first. Right? So Padmasambhava, who was a great Indian master, came to Tibet around 800 and started teaching, and so did Shantarakshita. They were 2 great Indian teachers. So they started Buddhism. They actually founded, you know, they really were the founders of Buddhism in Tibet, along with King at that time. So that's one lineage that still exists. Then there came a point where Buddhism had almost died out because of particularly one bad king. So Buddhism had become quite degenerate. So this is around the time of Atisha, who I mentioned. So around that time, they called 3 new schools got formed. So one was Atisha's, right? He came, taught, and he formed the Kadampa tradition. And his main student was Lama Dromdonpa, who was a layperson who was a previous incarnation of the Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama was always there helping out. So that he founded the Kadampa tradition, which after Lama Tsongkhapa's time transformed into the Gelugpa tradition, which still exists, and it's the tradition in which the Dalai Lama was educated as a boy. You know, when he was young, that's how he got his education, was from the Gelugpa. And Khensa Rinpoche is a great master of the Gelugpa tradition, as is Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So then another tradition that arose around that same time was the Kagyu tradition, which was mainly founded, there was a great Indian master in Naropa. So Marpa went to India, studied with Naropa, achieved enlightenment, and then had this great disciple called Milarepa, whose life story we're going to read in a later one in this series of classes, not in this one, but in a later one. And so they and then Milarepa's student Gampopa, they founded the Kagyu tradition. It's great, another great. So all four of these, and then there was another one called the Sakya tradition. The Sakyas were actually a family that actually had been practicing Buddhism from the time of Padmasambhava. Their ancestor had been a disciple of Padmasambhava. But around this time, around the same time period, that when the new schools were forming, they brought some lineages from the master Virupa, the Indian master Mahasiddha, a great master of Virupa, to Tibet, and so they founded then what was still known as the Sakya tradition. So those, and I wanted to say something, like those are not contradictory traditions. In case people have confusion about that, they're just like, they're just different lineages, but actually over the years, many of them have combined. So for example, the Gelugpa tradition actually has teachings from the Kagyu, Sakya, and Nyingma. The Sakya tradition has elements of the Kadampa. The Kagyu tradition has elements of the Kadampa. So it's not like there's not a rivalry there. Sometimes in history there were mistakes made and there were rivalries, but nowadays that's old news. The main point is that they all present the same basic teachings. Does that make sense? So then, the particular way that so the Guyi Samaja Center, right? We mainly have emphasized teachings from the Gelugpa tradition coming down through Lama Tsongkhapa, who was a great Tibetan master in the 1400s, who was the teacher of the first Dalai Lama, and so we'll be studying, and the reason why I say that is that we'll be studying one of his texts in this class called the Three Principal Aspects of the Path. That's what we're going to start in on next class, is his text, The Three Principal Aspects of the Path. Okay, so that's a little overview of Buddhist history, very brief. Also, one last comment on Buddhist history. Like, you know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, if you've ever heard him talk or teach in the last 20 years, he over and over emphasizes, he says that he doesn't think it should be called really Tibetan Buddhism, or that that's not really a relevant term. He calls it Nalanda Buddhism. So Nalanda was a great Buddhist monastery and university near Bodh Gaya, actually, where Nagarjuna was a professor, so to speak. And actually, all the great Indian Buddhist saints lived or taught. Atisha went there. Everybody went to Nalanda. So in some sense, I just want to mention that. So in some sense, Tibetan Buddhism isn't Tibetan Buddhism, it's Nalanda Buddhism. In other words, it's a Buddhism that attempted and succeeded in preserving the lineages of the great scholars up in Nalanda University. And Nalanda is just a place where pretty much all the great Indian Buddhist masters of the Mahayana tradition, but many of the Theravada tradition also taught. Okay, so I'd said we would meditate a little bit more, and we still have time. So one last thing here, right? So there are two kinds of meditation, two main kinds. What we started with was the first one. It's called single-pointed concentration. In single-pointed meditation, right, or single-point concentration meditation, you try to focus on one thing. So remember when we were focusing on the breath? The breath would be your one thing, right? But that could be anything, right? You could pick anything and say, okay, I'm going to focus on that, right? And if it's a neutral or a virtuous object, you can use it for your meditation. If you're focusing single-pointedly on anger, that doesn't count. It's not meditation. And probably we're good at that. Or desire. If you're thinking, I really want this, I really want it, I really want it, I really want it. That's not meditation. That is single-pointed in a way. It's not meditation. Meditation has to be actually on something positive. But so single-pointed meditation is where you choose an object, right? And when your mind goes away, you keep bringing it back. You keep bringing it back. You keep bringing it back. Right? And eventually, you develop more and more concentration on that object. So we did that just very briefly in the beginning of the session, right, with the breathing thing. So the second kind of meditation, which is what we're going to do a lot of over this next series of classes, is, you might call it either analytical meditation or contemplation meditation. I like the word contemplation, although analysis is good too. And so, since next time we're going to be getting into the three principles of the path and the Four Noble Truths, let's stay with what, this is related to those. So what I'd like to do is just for 10 minutes, we'll do a brief meditation of that type on I'll call it the truth of suffering or renunciation, depending which one, how you want it. It's both the same thing. So let's try that, right? So if you're going to do a contemplative meditation, right, again you would get in a posture for meditation. But here, what we do is actually analyze something, right? Or contemplate on something. So, and one thing I'll say is, so if you're contemplating something, right? Like right now we're going to contemplate the truth of suffering as a motivator to practice the path to liberation. So while you're contemplating that, there's a similarity to single point concentration in this way. If something else arises, like a thought about work that's unrelated to this, or a thought about what you're going to do later, or even like a brilliant idea about love, you put it aside. Right? Even if it's something wonderful like, oh, I love all beings, okay, good. That's not what we're doing now. Put it aside for now. Okay? So there's still that. In other words, you focus on what you're focusing on. Right? So here what we'll contemplate on, right, is this. Just got to settle in for a moment. So the first point we'll contemplate, right, is it true, right, in my experience, is it true that life on this planet, life as I know it, is subject to suffering? And so when you're contemplating on that, which we'll go start right now, right? It means like look at it from different angles, right? So first of all, like as my own life, in my own life, am I free from suffering or am I subject to suffering? We can go through just some of the examples. You know, we're using the Buddha's life here, since that's what we talked about today. So, do I have some ability to remain always healthy? Or am I subject to illness? Do I know that I won't get a terrible illness? Or am I, like every other person on this planet, subject even to terrible illnesses? Am I subject to old age and the sufferings of old age? Or do I somehow imagine that those sufferings won't come? Am I subject even to death? Or do I somehow imagine that death won't come to me? Just like Siddhartha contemplated, and he was back in the palace, and we contemplate. Am I and everyone around me, all my friends, relatives, co-workers, neighbors, are we all subject to those things? Is it true that we're subject to uncertainty? That we never know? Whether it's like in terms of our finances, our health, the well-being of people we care about, the well-being of whether it's our job, or our country, our neighborhood, our weather. Do we have some kind of certainty, or is it uncertain? Another kind of suffering, right, that we can contemplate on is it true, in other words, does anybody achieve some kind of, anybody who's not enlightened, do they achieve some kind of ultimate satisfaction, or do they always want something else? Do we always want something else, something more, something different? Feeling that then we'll be happy. Just, you can continue in your own way. Try to contemplate from various perspectives. Is there any way around the conclusion? Is it 100% clear, or is there any way around the conclusion that ordinary life is subject to many kinds of suffering? There's the sufferings of sickness, old age, and death. The sufferings of not getting what you want. The sufferings of getting what you want, not being satisfied. one more point to contemplate before we stop. Is so the life of Siddhartha, the life of the Buddha, clearly says, right, that some kind of liberation from that. Not an external place, obviously, right? Buddha remained in India, so it's not an external place, but that some kind of inner realization, some kind of inner enlightenment can liberate a person from all those sufferings, where they no longer experience a subjective, because suffering happens in the mind, right? So the Buddha's life teaches that it's possible for a person to achieve an internal state, an inner state of mind, where they no longer suffer. And this is not talking about that they can rationalize suffering, or that they can bear suffering. That's not what the Buddha was aiming for, right? He was aiming for an actual liberation. So just take a moment to contemplate, just to think, right? It's just contemplation, but to contemplate, what would that be like? What does that mean, actually? To have a state of cessation, actually. A cessation of suffering. State of liberation, freedom. Just for another minute, we'll contemplate. Can you even imagine a state, like a state where you no longer, because you're liberated from suffering, you no longer have any fears, any personal needs. And so your entire existence then is that you're free then to be completely lovingly available to others, because you're liberated from all fear and all personal need. Like that, then you would be a being of pure love, total availability to others, with no tightness, no anxiety, no confusion. Okay, so let's come back together. So we started with our setting on motivation. So Buddhist practice always at the end we dedicate. So that's any merit, any good energy, any positive karma, any virtue that we've created. Let's dedicate it so that we can progress and path. So that whatever realizations like Atisha, Lamatsangkhapa, Nagarjuna, Sangha, and the Buddha achieved, let's dedicate these minutes so that we can also achieve whatever insights, whatever compassion and wisdom they achieve. And we also achieve that in order to do what they did, to benefit others, to be of service to others. Especially in the compassion of bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, let it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, let it not decrease, but increase more and more. And then you can dedicate, right, for anybody, people you know who are sick, may they be healed, who are afraid, may they be freed from fear. And you can dedicate it any way you want like that. And especially, right, may we all become fully enlightened to benefit others. May the teachings on compassion and wisdom last long. The Dalai Lama and all the other spiritual teachers live long, all their wishes be fulfilled. And so, for those who are doing the reading, if you keep, do try to finish Pabonka Rinpoche's 100 pages, and I'll send out an email with the other, I'll send out an email in the next week or two with the other details. Oh, and there's a book here, yeah, that's one of the assignments, so you feel free, this is free, take a copy. It's a book by Lama Yeshe that's part of this